One person said that the central friction with the son in the prodigal story is that he had forgotten where he belonged. Maybe at our core, to be human is to belong to a place, and with that place, to belong with and for a community. But why, then, is it so common for us to feel rootless and displaced? And I wonder what it would be like to belong somewhere without the instinct to police that space. Why, if belonging is a part of what we are made for, do we experience so much exclusion?
But I also think that a lot of our exclusion comes because we're chasing some illusion of belonging that never really exists.
Belonging and fear. Today on Don't Hold Me to This. I wonder if there's something about belonging that somehow has like baked into it its own opposite. In order for me to feel like I belong, I have to whatever group I want to know that I belong to. I have to know that somebody else doesn't belong. If I belong but everybody else belongs, then there's nothing special about belonging, or at least that's what I tell myself. But if I belong to this group, if I'm on the inside of this circle, I'm a person that belongs to this club, or I'm a person that's achieved a certain amount of wealth, or I'm a person who gets to wear this certain type of brand of clothing or whatever. It's not special unless other people don't get that. And so in some sense, I think we have told ourselves this story about belonging that has led us to become gatekeepers of our own community, to keep other people out, so that I know who belongs and who doesn't, because my sense of belonging requires a sense that it's exclusive, that other people don't belong. I mean, I guess two things come to mind for me. I guess first, I wonder if that's true. Is that in some way functioning as an instinct within my own self, or within the sort of broader concept of belonging, such that I'm led to be a gatekeeper of my own community, that baked into my definition of belonging is this sort of standing at the boundary and making sure people who are not like me don't get in. And in some sense that makes logical sense to me. Belonging without exclusivity maybe loses some of its definition. And if that's true, is there another way to think about belonging that doesn't carry around its opposite, that isn't definitionally exclusionary? So a kind of belonging that says, belonging is special and desirable, and it's what we need, and everybody can have it. And maybe in some ways, everybody already has it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know about a sense of belonging without also a sense of something of exclusion. Maybe there's a way that it doesn't have to be an exclusion that's also a resistance to others being welcomed, right? To still inviting belonging. I think my brain is spinning around Miroslav Volf's whole picture of exclusion and embrace. There's an exclusion that is harmful because it others and seeks to in some ways destroy, but in its othering.
Uh-huh.
But there's also a belonging that destroys because then it subsumes and
Yep.
devours. It loses boundary, right? It
Right.
loses so like if we talk about this in religious circles, like I think one of the most disrespectful things that you could possibly say is that, Christians, Muslims, Jews, religions, these different, they all basically believe the same thing.
Right.
But it's not really kind of me to look at a Muslim friend and say, well, you basically believe what I do, because that's not actually what he would say or she
Right.
would.
Yeah.
And so there's something to that boundary that needs to be honored, and the difference that needs to be honored, but without a destructive kind of exclusion,
Yeah.
and othering,
Yeah.
and a seek to either subsume them under all one thing and say you really don't have anything to offer that everybody else isn't already offering too.
Mm-hmm.
um and so in interpersonal relationships, that's a kind of emotional enmeshment that dehumanizes the person.
Right.
And in terms of groups and belonging, it's a similar kind of dehumanizing of their value and their difference,
Yeah.
and learning how to value that difference. And so, Wolf obviously talks about this in terms of embrace, that there's these two distinct things, and an embrace is a way of opening yourself up to bring the other into an embrace, but
Right.
also to allow them to remain another.
Yeah.
The embrace has to end, and when it ends, that person, that individual, or that group remains. So I don't know, that's where my mind is going as I think about this, the possibility of of belonging without some kind of boundary
Mm-hmm.
or identity around which you belong.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know how that dynamic is. I don't know how I don't know how it's avoidable, or even if it's desirable,
Yeah.
at least in a world where um, you know we're going to have to live with difference. There's
Yeah.
there's no um, and I don't know that that's wrong. I think that there's a beauty in the difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's right, the difference between unanimity and unity. We can operate together without being singular in the way we think about everything.
Yeah.
And so that kind of difference immediately creates some kind of boundary, right? A boundary of at least difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah. 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 A boundary of my personhood. In order to not make the mistake of a kind of devouring embrace, I have to maintain at least the boundary of who I am.
uh,
In fact, what's interesting is Matthias Desmet, uh, he's written a lot recently on what he has called mass formation, which is, I recognize, a volatile term in our political moment, but I think it's a really important way of describing. He talks about the way a kind of authoritarianism works, and he makes this distinction between um, relationships between individuals where these people belong to and with each other, and a relationship between the individual and what he calls the collective, the thing to
right.
which you belong, which is a kind of set of ideas in his description. And the way totalitarianism works is that what it wants to do is strip away all of the relationships between individuals, so that every connection is between the individual and the bigger collective, not between individuals. There's why you can have, in a kind of totalitarian state, you can have one individual who's a member of the community, belongs to the community, kind of rat on another individual within the community, because while they may have a really great relationship individually toward each other, the person who's being ratted out doesn't have a good relationship to the collective, which in that system is all that matters. So you get lost in the kind of the amorphous collective. You lose the boundary of self, of your individuality, right? So
when the person who rats has also lost it, right? Because they can't value the individual. Their relationship with the individual never would trump the way they value their identity in relationship to the collective.
That's right. In fact, this gives an
cults
example.
do, right? It's
exactly right. This is that's the sort of locus classicus of the idea of mass formation as a cult. It's a whole bunch of people that would believing something they would never all individually believe on their own, right? There's something really powerful about the collective that that forms the individuals into something that they otherwise wouldn't have become. And in this sense, it's a set of ideas that are clearly destructive, or at least clear to the outsiders that they are destructive. But what's interesting is that all of that turns on this deep-seated, intuitive desire to belong to something.
Yeah, for sure.
So the belonging is sort of fundamental, even before the ideas or the system or the collective to which you belong. The desire to know, this is where I go. These are my people. This is my community. This is where I have some fit. That's even more fundamental than that. And I wonder if that, for me, brings up a kind of way forward in the conundrum about like belonging and a kind of exclusivity, is to think about it in terms of rather than of belonging, to think about it as in terms of belongings, not the things I own, but
it's not a fixed reality.
It changes over in two ways. It changes over time, because I change over time, and the nature of my belonging is always going to be related to my sense of self. But it also changes in terms, like relationally, in terms of spaces. So like, I belong to my house church, right? I also belong to my neighborhood, which is in a different city. Those are both real and meaningful and formative, but there's not any overlap. Those are two separate circles, and yet they're both equally meaningful in terms of my sense and desire for belonging. And then I think underneath all of that, and maybe this is the way that belonging can work in a way that's not exclusionary, on top of which we then build these smaller belongings that are by definition necessarily boundaried, is the most fundamental belonging is that we all belong to the same human family. All humans are, by virtue of being human, a part of the human family. And we belong to that, and at that level belong to each other. And I use the language of family rather than like we belong to the human species, because I think there is something like there's something moral and imagination shaping about considering oneself a family member to every other human being. It's like there's like some upsides to that. It's like the way you'd think about uh, a really good relationship between two brothers. Like that's what we want. That's
Mhm.
the sort of belonging that we, I think, long for. That kind of deep knowing, have a long history of experiences with each other. We've got our own inside jokes and our own way of talking about things, our own sort of dialect. But I think the downsides, or let's come at it from a negative perspective, is like we all know that like the cliche of the drunk uncle who comes to every Thanksgiving get together, though we keep explicitly not inviting him. He just keeps showing up because he's family, and we let him in because he's family. Um, uh, he belongs at a more fundamental level than the expression of his behaviors, right? And I think one of the major challenges, and the reason why I'm thinking about this right now, one of the major challenges I think that we're experiencing on a cultural level is a kind of preference for belonging along the pathway of very well defined, explicit, and niche beliefs. And that's where we're locating all of our belonging right now.
Yeah.
What do you go
And
ahead?
that's never shifting standard, right?
Right.
Uh, you know,
Yeah, like you can think about every group as a kind of a circle where there's different closenesses to the center.
mhm,
And what's happening now is every circle of these niche beliefs is shrinking. So at some point you're on the edge of a group that 5 years ago you were solidly a part of because you believed in a certain set of political conclusions or whatever. You're
right.
now no longer a part of that, because the when you have belonging based on adherence to a set of niche beliefs, movement into the future looks like becoming increasingly niche, increasingly uh, uh, close to the center of that set of beliefs. And so people are um, constantly being lopped off the edges of those circles, finding themselves no longer in the place where they thought they were 5 years ago. I mean, we're talking about this on a day that Tulsi Gabbard has left the Democratic Party for this very reason, right? And the same is true on the other side. People leaving the Republican Party because it's become something other than
Yeah.
what they were or what it used to be, and that's all because we have construed um, belonging as having a one-to-one correlation to a set of increasingly narrow political, cultural conclusions. And I
Yeah.
and I wonder if having this like a kind of my most fundamental belonging is a belonging that is below anything that I believe, namely a belonging to the human family. So that before I even start talking about it, I've already belonged to something.
Yeah, I haven't. I mean, there's one example comes to mind, which is a few years back. I observed, on Facebook, a post by a fellow pastor in my denomination,
Mm-hmm.
um, and he's on Facebook publicly, sort of mocking and scorning a woman for her stated beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and whether I agreed with her beliefs or not, it really isn't the issue. But I reached out to him and said, "Hey," and I'm pretty sure I did this privately because I tend not to um, try to correct people on their own fora
Sure,
forum,
sure. Yeah.
let them, do whatever it is they do. But um, it was just like, hey, we should be, I don't you think, for the sake of the gospel, we should be kinder and not mocking of this sister.
Mm-hmm.
And I called her a sister.
Yeah.
And I had nothing to do with whether I thought she was a Christian.
Right.
But his retort, his response was a vehement, she absolutely was not a Christian and therefore deserves no, you know,
Yeah.
no kindness. I was like,
Yeah.
one, I wasn't, what does it matter that whether you think she's a Christian or not?
Right.
This
Right.
is
Right.
this is a this is a human being, and you're a pastor
Right.
publicly mocking another human. It
Yeah.
just it seems so untoward. So I see what you're saying, and I think we could probably go through and list example after example of that kind of
Absolutely.
treatment of people and a refusal to embrace them as just fellow brothers and sisters as human beings,
Right.
not whether they're in our particular club or not.
Yeah.
Um, but then I also want to circle back to where you started, which is this notion that I'm not disagreeing. I think you're
Yeah.
right that part of belonging, we do set ourselves up as maybe the gatekeeper for who's out, because that is a part of how we derive a sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that a lot of our exclusion
Mm.
comes from not so much from the active gatekeeping, but from the illusion, but because we're chasing some illusion of belonging that never really exists.
Mm.
So we're so focused on moving closer and closer to the center of the ideal
Yeah.
that by just a very by the very frantic way that we're trying to sort of, it's C.S. Lewis's essay on the inner circle, right?
Yeah.
He talks about working so hard to get in the inner circle, and then he gets into that circle and realizes that everybody's in there is trying to get into another one, right? That
Right.
there's this
That's right.
that kind of sense that will someday, that this is the way that we arrive at belonging, is to sort of somehow move deeper and deeper into these idealized spaces that somehow are going to provide something that they can't, and in so doing we wind up excluding, it's a more passive excluding of
Yeah.
what's right in front of us, right?
Yeah.
Instead of posturing ourselves in the way that I think you've set it up, which is posturing ourselves um, with within a perspective that every person is this every person that I encounter is a part of um, my belongings, and the
Yeah.
places I belong. Maybe too, we we don't see that belonging, that our coming into a space of belonging includes our welcome of
Yes.
others,
Yes.
right? And so again, I think that's at least that passive part of this equation where we just pass over people, um, because we don't actually see that as we proactively welcome,
Mm-hmm.
um, that we in turn find our own welcome. The conversations we've had about several different kinds of things, that these flow together, but showing the kind of curiosity and kindness
Mm-hmm.
um, and valuing of the other person, the other in a in the best sense of that word,
Yeah.
just the people who are not me, as we posture ourselves in healthier ways toward the other, the very thing that we long for in terms of our own belonging becomes more available to us.
And I think that's why, for me at least, as I think, as my head turns around this, recognizing that before I ever had the capacity or the faculty to think about belonging, I was invited to belong to something. As an infant, born into the human family, one on a fundamental level, born into my biological family, on another level. Um, I I was invited, like, fundamental to my identity is invited to belong.
Mm-hmm.
Having been invited to belong, like that's sort of etched in stone. Um, without like asking me to weigh in on it, on whether I wanted to be. And I recognize that like there's all sorts of negative experiences of family life that make this not an attractive uh, proposition to consider oneself invited. There's still, I think, this uh, deep desire that each of us has as a human to belong somewhere and to know where that is and what it is, and who it makes me. That suggests this is a kind of, it's a thing kind of built into what it means to be a human. What it means to be a human is that you are invited to belong to the human family. And if that's the case, then then in all of my separate belongings, all of the different communities to which I belong, I recognize myself as having been invited, having been welcomed. Part of the structure of who I am is one who is invited, and so that I can then in turn reciprocate that inviting. I think the image that came to mind as you were talking is like the entrance into belonging is through what was an open door, and for some reason we have this instinct and impulse to shut it behind us, or maybe because our moms told us as we were growing up, you weren't raised in a barn, shut the door, you weren't raised in a barn. But maybe when it comes to our sense of belonging, as we enter into a space of belonging through an open door, we should consider ourselves having been raised in a barn, where it's okay to leave the door open. This is really bad agrarian ideas. You don't leave the barn door open. I don't know where that saying came from. It's not okay to leave a barn door open either, Mom. Yeah, I mean, so I think I understand and recognize, and in many ways empathize with the sense that my belonging to a particular group has to bring with it an instinct to exclude other people from that group unless they meet a certain set of criteria. That makes sense to me. Whether it's good or bad, I'm not saying, although it feels bad. But it makes sense. My fear that if everybody can belong, then my belonging is no longer special, I get that. I also wonder if there's other fears at play that maybe are deeper than that, that that I'm kind of making these preferences toward belonging to certain clubs and groups because they're made up of other people who are in important ways already like me. I know what to expect. I know what language to speak. I know that I can fit in because I know how to move in these spaces, because the membership in this space is controlled to a certain set of people that are already like me. And the fear is that if other people can belong, then the character and the nature of this space changes, and I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be in that space. And I wonder what it would be like to belong somewhere without adopting the instinct to police that space.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it that way, it feels like idealism,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
So, and I don't mean it in a that's necessarily bad. It just means that I lay the Christian story over that, and it's like, okay, but we're outside the garden.
Uh-huh.
I feel like we're talking about the echoes of things that we are certainly made for, that
Yeah.
we all long for.
Yeah.
And you know, as you were talking, you know, you're born into belonging, even for folks who, when they hear that in terms of their own story and their own family of origin, as through trauma and tragedy and grief, you know, what we still know is that every child is born needing to feel safe. And I mean, this is just attachment theory, right? A child needs to belong. They
Yep.
that and so where we a lot of what we have, what we're struggling with in our culture, even on these bigger things, like even our political discourse and our inability to just be civil to one another, what we know is a lot of that is downstream effects of not belonging well as
Yep.
children.
Right. Yep.
Um, so 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 what we know is there's a brokenness that's entered the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear what you're saying, but then I think maybe the what we're looking for isn't a place where you can belong and not not feel any need to tend to, you know, who else may enter that space. um but it but I think at every level of sort of healthy humanity, part of creating safe places of belonging, you have to tend to
Yep.
who enters that space. It just And so I think we're stuck in what we're made for, and what we sort of all, I think, on a deep visceral level long for and certainly need as humans. But we also live in this
Mm-hmm.
fractured space. And so that makes me just wonder, okay, then how do we live in this push and pull um, of difference,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in a way that still maximizes the humanity of the other,
Yep.
rather than seeks to destroy and minimize and destroy the humanity of the
Right.
other.
Right.
Um, and um, like I want to say, hey, I think it's okay that we have a two-party system, and that some people care enough about it that they want to take on a label and say I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and sort of and 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 sort of divide up according to those political ideologies.
Yeah.
Um, but what I think we're looking for is then, but then how do we like how do we manage our that identity in such a way that it it um it still looks to maximize the humanity of my Republican opponent or
Right.
my Democrat opponent
Yep.
or and I that's where I think uh the the hard work sits in front of us, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about it.
Yeah.
Um, I do think about I listened to this recently again because I was telling somebody about it, but there's the story of Daryl Davis, um, a black musician who back in the '80s had joined he was playing with a country and western band, and his story is that um, you know at this place he played in Maryland, a guy comes over to him and says, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Um, I've never heard a black man play like Jerry Lee Lewis. And Daryl Davis laughs and he says, "Well, Jerry Lee Lewis learned to play that way from," and he listed off a bunch of black musicians.
Yeah.
And this guy turns out to be a KKK member and
Mm.
doesn't believe that, but they actually Daryl Davis befriends him, and his story is that he winds up actually actively befriending, going out to meet and understand what drives his words is drives someone to hate him who doesn't even know him.
Yep.
And in the end, he winds up being gifted, I think it's three Grand Wizard's robes as they renounce their allegiance to the KKK because he befriended them. And I think about that story, and I know he gets a lot of pushback for, like, people are like, "What are you doing? You're treating these people with kindness, like they're humans,
Yes.
and you're hurting the cause."
Yeah.
He's like, "But I have I have these three men who have renounced the highest position in the KKK because I befriended them. Well,
Yeah.
what am I doing
Right.
wrong?"
Right. Yeah. Right.
And one of the things he said is fascinating. And I think this is true. Whether that's something, I think he's uniquely gifted and called to do that, but there's something he's doing that I would say is commendable.
Mm.
But he says, when you're curious, when you show curiosity toward another person, you're passively teaching them something about yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and basically, that was his whole posture: is as I'm showing curiosity and kindness to this person who hates me just because of my skin color, I though they're not asking me, I'm still passively teaching them something
Mm-hmm.
about kindness and respect, and eventually, he was able to win some folks over. I think about that as the that kind of work is just extremely difficult.
Well, and what's interesting is that in that situation, and I'm familiar with the kind of the broad outlines of the story, but I've not read it in any detail. And so I'm gonna make some gestures, and maybe I'm wrong. But it seems to me that a kind of preference for and commitment to belonging had to predate the actual belonging of those men together. For Daryl, he had already done the thing that he helped them to do. He had renounced the idea that they don't belong together. And then he invited them to renounce the idea that they don't belong
I
together.
think he would agree with that.
And so what's interesting is that the fundamental brokenness of their sense of exclusivity of their group was at the human level. We don't belong with them because in some sense we're not the same class of human. We're different humans.
Mm-hmm.
We're a kind of human and they're a kind of human, or they're not human at all, right? And what to put it in this language, what Daryl did was slowly model for them what it looks like to renounce the idea that they don't belong together.
Right.
So that their individual belonging to each other and with each other, now these three former Klan members with this Black musician, is built on now this deep sense that they are a part of the same human family.
Right.
And it's now grown up into actualized belonging together. And I wonder, like, that one of the challenges with our kind of political discourse is when we name ourselves one of those things in our current cultural moment, our current cultural and political moment. I'm a Democrat, I'm a libertarian, I'm a Republican, or whatever. We have in some sense lost the idea that those conclusions are built on top of something else. So that the only thing about me is that I'm a Democrat. The only thing about me is that I'm a Republican. There's nothing underneath it. Mm-hmm. So I can't have anything in common with those people over there in that circle, because they have a circle drawn around themselves and I have a circle drawn around me and my group, and there's nothing underneath it. That's all there is to say. So that if you don't agree with me in this way, you are a threat to democracy. This is the language we've begun to use, right? It's religious language. You have attacked the temple of democracy. Right. We've theologized the whole process. Instead of saying, no, I'm a Democrat or a Libertarian or a Republican or Green or whatever all the other options are. Because here's a certain set of things that I think about our moral imagination and our social commitments and our commitments to the environment. And I recognize that we disagree on a certain set of things. But in some way, I have tuned myself to at least be able to understand your conclusions and to see how you got there. Mm-hmm. Even if I still end up disagreeing. And I can do that because it's the bottom of those parties, the bottom of my self-identity is not a tight circle around Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or pick anything. I like this kind of music and you don't, right? But but the bottom of the circle is open to a foundation of shared common humanity, even though we might have zero overlap in terms of our cultural and political conclusions. Maybe there's zero overlap. We are both still in this shared circle. This is what makes possible a relationship between three former Klan grand wizards and a Black musician, in the same way that it makes possible, or in similar ways that it makes possible, relationships between people who have less volatile political disagreements. And I think I feel that, at least in the kind of the most publicized discourse that I see on mm-hmm. screens, which is maybe the least important, I want to grant that. It feels like we're losing that. We're willingly or unknowingly walking away from this shared fundamental unity that I think we all still have and we all still really long for, but we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know that we're allowed to talk about it. Maybe that's a important piece. We don't have the imagination for the way in which it shapes us as well, as you said to your friend on Facebook, as genuine members of the same family, as brothers and sisters at the core fundamental level.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, and I was going to say, I think maybe at least in part, certainly in part, I think I can say it that way. It is because a lot of that discourse is either observed or participated in through screens.
Yeah, that's right. Like this one.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, but there's right. There's I think there's something to that. And then I think I want to also just at least it makes me wonder. I think that the ability to do that well, like the ability to imagine at least why somebody thinks the way they do and has come to the conclusions they have, and not just go, well, that conclusion's wrong, you're out. It seems like that one huge element to working against treating others that way is a deep, some level of self-reflection and knowledge of how you got to your conclusions.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's just an acknowledgement that your shit stinks too, right? That you realize that that your position is not as airtight as any political platform wants to make it.
Yeah.
It's not as simplistic. It's not, and it's not as black and white, and yet I do wonder if there's a growing, and I hate to say this because I don't want to imagine that there was some glory day where we were right.
Sure.
We were all much more self-aware, and because that's we know that's nonsense too.
Right.
But I do wonder if there is a something in the dynamic that we're currently experiencing that makes us less reflective, or makes the more reactive voices the ones that get privileged in the conversation.
Yep.
And so again, I think there's difficult work to be done here, but in order for me to safely and healthily open myself up to an other, there has to be some real healthy self-knowledge.
Yeah, that's right.
And I wonder if we've I don't know what the right word is, if our self-knowledge has been truncated, or some sense of the urgency of the moment has left us thinking we don't need, we don't have time for that, right? We've got to, I know in political discourse, it's like, we got to win this election, right? Vote or die. I made that joke, but it's like, we've made these things so urgent in life and death that we don't even take the time to tend to what our own house. And I don't think we make for good friends when we haven't tended well to our own health. And so it seems like in this sense of belonging, some of what's been lost, or what works against us, is that lack of real self care, self knowledge, self reflection, and even just admitting we're wrong, right?
Yeah.
And an ability to just do healthy human things, like say I was wrong, or I don't know, I'm sorry.
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
you know, very basic, seemingly basic things.
Yeah. Simon Sinek talks about this principle, I think that he calls like the dumbest person in the room, that curiosity starts with agreeing to be the dumbest person in the room. That I come into a space that's sort of charged with possibility, both good and bad. This could go either way. I could come into this space and be the guy who wants to police it and be in charge and be the know-it-all. Or I can come into this space and ask a bunch of questions and just imagine, I don't, there's an infinite amount of information to be known here, and relationship to be experienced, more than what I already know and what I've already experienced.
Mm-hmm.
That's always true. And so I want to be curious. In order to be curious, I have to have the humility to think probably these people know more and have more to offer into this situation than I do. So I just want to listen, and I want to ask good questions, and I want to offer myself into it in terms of conversation and ideas. And but what I want to do is I want to be the guy that leaves the door open rather than closes it behind me. So I kind of want to be the I want to have a pre-commitment to that, and that's part of that self-awareness. But I think also it's interesting, as you were talking, I've never thought about it this way, but the beginning of belonging, this beginning of this new kind of rich experience of belonging, is attending to my own fears and anxieties, right? About myself and about other people and about the whole process and concept of belonging, about the experience of belonging. Like, what is it that I'm afraid will happen if I try this in a different way? And is that fear justified? And is even if the bad thing happens, whatever I'm afraid of, is that debilitating? Is it life-threatening? Is it as bad as I'm telling myself that it is? And once I've done that, and it obviously that's an ongoing thing. As I'm doing that, maybe is a better way to put it. I'm more and more situated to resist that anxiety and fear, and just be open to the person that I'm sitting across from, or the people I'm sitting across from. I think of and we may have said this in a previous conversation, that someone said somewhere that Jesus was you could make the argument that Jesus was killed for whom he ate with.
Yeah.
And somehow the stories about Jesus's meal eating habits suggest that he didn't have the same fears and anxieties that I do, right? About inviting all of my neighbors. We've moved in the last year, moved to a new city. That's 40 minutes away from the city in which our lives are, where I work. And I keep having this idea of just inviting all of my neighbors over into our yard and making hot dogs, just because if I cook steaks, I'll ruin them. And if I make hamburgers, they're burnt on the outside and red on the inside. So hot dogs are, and I haven't done it yet, in part because I keep telling myself, I don't know these people. I don't, will they like me? Will I like them? Are they the kind of people that I want to belong to? And I think this whole conversation, what it wants to say to me is you already belong to them. You live on the same street. So you have one of your belongings is you live in Mesa Junction. That's the neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. I think we can. I have felt this in our even in our conversation here, which is we can get into this space where one the and I, this is where the ideal overwhelms us,
Yes, right. That's
or
the whole
just
thing about hamburgers and steaks, right?
right, or just the bigness of the problem
Yeah.
can overwhelm us, and we can lose sight of the fact that and again, this goes back to Daryl Davis. I think this is another quote by him, something along the lines: if you're gonna, I think I saw this quote recently. Maybe this wasn't him. I can't now. I'm gonna. But basically, if you're gonna change someone, you're gonna have to eat a meal with them, right? If you're gonna
Yes.
see somebody change,
Yes.
you're gonna. And so some of this, um, it's a helpful reminder to remember that this really isn't. This starts small, and it starts with the person already, right? This who's this starts with the encounters that are already a part of your life,
Right.
which is what what your poem is about, right? It's a part of your established rhythm,
Mm-hmm.
but it's an established rhythm because you very intentionally have said, I'm gonna make myself available to my community by being in these places.
Yeah.
I'm and I'm gonna go sit when I can, as often as I can. I'm gonna go sit and have a cup of coffee and be present,
Yeah.
physically present with the people who work there and the people who also come and sit there to drink their coffee and eat their pastry or whatever.
Yeah. Pop Tart.
So there's what
Pop Tart. It was a Pop Tart. Yeah.
And so there's uh, and I would tell I would tell my congregation this, in in talking about this what this means for us is that we literally invite our neighbors over,
Yeah.
and maybe more importantly, we allow, especially for people who are very different than us, we allow ourselves to be invited to their homes,
Yes.
and to their tables, and we put ourselves in a position of being out of our home base, safe territory,
Yep.
in order to be welcomed. Because again, I think when I think about Jesus's hospitality, it wasn't that he welcomed the sinner, but he allowed himself to be welcomed by the sinner.
Yeah.
And actually, what was transformative wasn't that he said, Zacchaeus, you got to come to my house and have burgers with me. He said, I got to come to your house.
Yeah.
I need to be hosted by you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an inversion that he took on, but and regularly.
Yep.
Um uh and profoundly changed people because of that. And so I think that's a really helpful reminder that these things are things like actually knowing your neighbors and inviting them over. It's actually I try to find a, a, a coffee shop where I like, one of my goals is to walk into a coffee shop and for them to already know what I'm probably going to order.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's really important. And I think this is surely a conversation, another conversation, but some of what we're dealing with in this sense of this desire for belonging, but struggle to find it, is not simply psychological and relational. It is cultural. It is our built environment.
Yes.
And and the and a lot of the ideals that went into how we built our our neighborhoods and our cities. And so we're working against there's a lot of resistance in our culture to the kind of belonging that you're talking about. Walter Brueggemann, I went and found this quote as back when you were talking early on. He says the deepest human need and society's greatest failure is in its ability to provide for rootedness, not meaning. So he says our deepest problem is rootlessness, not meaninglessness.
Yes.
And I think what we're seeing, so again, downstream in our political discourse, is just symptomatic of that. That's at least what we're saying here in this conversation, is that those are symptoms of a deep rootlessness, and then a false kind of belonging that we're constructing.
What Taya Selassie has suggested in her TED Talk is, rather than asking where somebody is from, she says, I want to ask people, where are they local? Where are you local? Because there's this really wonderful relationship between who I am and where I live, and that relationship is a two-way street. I form the place that I live in by my contributions or lack of contributions to it, and that's the people that are there and the shape of the space and whether or not there are bike lanes and whether those bike lanes get used. And I form the place I live in, and it forms me. I am who I am in large part because of where I'm local. And I think what's one of the burdens that I think we're dealing with is that we have been told, and for good reason, that we ought to consider ourselves citizens of the world.
Sure.
We are global citizens. Yes. And we are in large part powerless. I don't say that to communicate some sort of hopelessness, but we are in large part powerless to make global changes. Only one of the citizens of the United States can be the president at a time. And that means all the rest of us won't for that 4 years, and likely won't for all of our lives. Only one person can be the mayor of your town or the governor of your state at a time. And 99.9% of us won't be that. But that doesn't mean that we're powerless to make a difference. It just means that the change that we can affect in terms of a kind of sense of belonging in the fabric of our space is local. It's all local. That's where we live. That's where we can do our thing. Even if we were to fly to somewhere else, we're not global. Now we're there. We're just in a different locale. We're never global, right? We can't be on the globe, all over the globe. We can only be in one locale at a time, and that's where we live our lives, and that's where we do our thing. And I think that for me is like this. I'm trying to think of a way to say this in a way that doesn't sound uncaring. That's not my intention. That's not the way that I mean it. But I think what's happening right now in Ukraine, for example, is really important. And what am I going to do about it? Well, I'm going to vote, and I'm going to have beers with my neighbors. I don't have access to much anything else to make a difference in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I don't even have access to all the information about it. Like, I can't hold in my mind all the layers of things that are catalysts for what's happening there. But I can seek within the realm of my power to subvert the very things that allowed for that kind of conflict to occur, namely cooking hot dogs in my front yard for my neighbors. And I think that's a thing that I need to hear, is that actually that's where real change occurs. That's where real belonging takes place, is in the space between people that live in the same locale.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it simplifies it.
Don't Hold Me to This podcast is a production of Don't Hold Me to This. You can find out more, do some more reading, and get in touch at don'tholdmetothis.com. No apostrophe.